24. When the images came, Rodin took them for memories. The nightmares were from his past and he must welcome them. They were nothing he had not already faced. He could face them again. He had been cold in the hideaway. There was ice in the mornings and he could see his breath. Even under the blankets he had raided from nearby houses, he was freezing. Many of the abandoned buildings had already been looted for all their worth, but there were still some goods worth scavenging. He found old curtains that he wrapped around himself at night. He found old wooden furniture that he used to make a fire, although the room would soon fill with smoke. He would open the hatch, letting the smoke escape. In his desperation, he didn't even think of the possibility of it being seen. There was hardly anyone around to see him. About 2/3 of the houses were abandoned, possibly more. Those who lived in the others kept themselves to themselves. A bit of smoke would not force them to investigate. Rodin remembered the woman. She was in a house a few streets away. He had been watching the house for a few days, intrigued by the neatness of the building. Someone cleaned the windows and doors and tended the garden. Nothing major, but the path wasn't overgrown, and the weeds were kept at bay. At night there was no light from the windows. The curtains were closed most of the time during the day, and when they did open, some kind of netting restricted his view. He couldn't see much. But he persevered. He guessed it must have become something of a project, or simply something to do. Every day he'd watch. He could not be certain how many people were in the house, but there were only small indications of movement. Enough that he was led to believe there was only one occupant. He must have assumed the person was alone. Either that, or he was desperate. Otherwise, going to the door would have been a huge risk. But one day he did just that. He walked up the garden path, to the fading green door. Remains of nails and tacks covered the wood, and it was rough under his hands. He hammered on the door hard. There were imprints on his hand, circles and dips. He hammered again. And again. Maybe nobody answered that day. Maybe the same happened the day after. But eventually, the door did open. The sun was out. It shone down, and when the door opened, the woman's legs were in bright light with her top half in the shadows. She held her clothes tight to her body in protection. She had short hair chopped with a knife. Her skin was pocked but clean, he remembered that clearly. Amongst all the grime in the area, she stood out. Even without the sun on her head, she shone. Her eyes were grey. Maybe blue, maybe green, but grey all the same. He couldn't remember what he said that first time he saw her. Probably asked for food or water. He couldn't remember her words either. But he remembered her shutting the door, and remembered walking down the path empty-handed. But he returned. She must have been friendly. Maybe she was simply not aggressive. Maybe she was not unfriendly. And that was good enough for him. Another part of the memory surfaced, something else he saw that first time. By her side, in her hand, was a long sharp blade catching the light. He went back a few times. Each time he came away empty-handed. But he started taking things to her. Mostly tins of food. The hideaway then as now was well stocked. He didn't know why it hadn't been ransacked, but he wasn't going to think too much on that. There was a large cupboard crammed with tins and packets. There was pasta, meat chunks in sauces, processed vegetables, dried fruit. There was enough to keep him going for ages. So a few tins given away were no loss. And the woman started to smile. Eventually, she must have invited him in. The inside of the house was spotless. In the main living room, pictures hung on the wall, abstract art of some kind. There were 2 sofas complete with cushions and throws. A rug covered the polished floorboards. In the kitchen, the worktops were spotless, the draining board was empty, the fridge gleamed. The only things that looked incongruous were the wooden panels. They sat by the windows to both the front and the back. He knew they fitted the window frames. She made him a drink. No, she told him he could make a drink and make her one at the same time. Tea, he recalled. He'd searched her cupboards with no guidance from her. She stood in the doorway, the blade still at her side. She had powdered milk, but with tea this poor it would make no difference. He remembered thinking that clearly. So he was used to fresh milk. Rodin forced himself to remember that. He was used to luxury. They had a drink the next day, or the next time he visited. And the one after that. It became a habit. Always him making the tea, her standing with the blade at her side. He couldn't recall when the blade disappeared. Maybe a few weeks, maybe a month after she first invited him in. They must have talked, but he could only recall vague details. She had been living on her own for a few years. She had killed. She said this with no emotion, as if it was something that happened to everyone. If she told him who she killed, he didn't remember. It wasn't important. He couldn't guess her age. Her face was lined, her cheeks pulled down. Her hair would look better for a decent cut, but she kept it clean. She looked after herself as best she could. She never left the house unless she had to. Even weeding was a struggle. Rodin had the image of her out in the garden at night, a full moon her only light. He didn't know if this was his own memory or something she told him. Or maybe his own interpretation. Another memory came. The bedroom, as clean as all the other rooms. The sheets felt good against his body, especially after rough-worn curtains. Her body felt good too. There were scars, and he recalled tracing them with a finger. There was an initial reluctance. Not on her part, this was what she wanted and had been after for some time. All the cups of tea and the time spent talking, that was her way of checking him out, of making sure he wasn't a danger. She had been damaged before. In her own words, she had been used, and she didn't want that happening again. The reluctance was on his part. It was too soon. And there was someone else. He couldn't remember who. He remembered talking about a girl, but all the details had gone. And eventually, so had his reluctance. He wouldn't stay over. She was very clear on that. It was her house and her rules. So he still slept in his dark bunker. But he spent more time in her house, and especially in her bed. He couldn't recall the sex. It must have happened, they were definitely naked beneath the sheets and blankets, and he could almost taste the aroma of their bodies, still fresh from the moment of release, but what remained in his mind was the closeness. Touching, holding. The feel of her skin, the sense of her head on his chest. The feeling of security, even if it was fleeting. The feeling of letting go. She told him this was what she needed, an escape from the daily routine. In bed with him she lived. For the rest of the time she was existing. He couldn't recall how long this went on for. Maybe only a couple of weeks, maybe a few months. He did remember it being warm at one point, with the sun forcing its way through her curtains. He remembered the material shimmering with the breeze coming through the open window. But it was turning colder. It must have been. He remembered the shiver that ran through him. When he woke, Rodin felt refreshed. It was dark in the bunker, and when he checked the time he was surprised to find it was morning. He'd slept for hours. But he felt good for it. He used some of the supplies in the hideaway to make himself a breakfast of beans and hot dogs. He put a few packets and tins into his backpack. It never hurt to have extra meals to hand. When he left, Rodin was careful to disguise the trapdoor under the boxes. Then he was off, back towards the train tunnel. He knew it would be the easiest route to reach the northern border. As he walked, he looked around, unsurprised now at how familiar many of the properties looked. There were things he did not recognize, space where he recalled buildings, houses that looked different. That was only to be expected. It had been over a decade since he was last here. A lot could change in 10 years. A boy could grow to be a man in such a time. Last time he had been here, he was in his early 20s. Old enough to be a man, but he had acted like a boy. It didn't feel right. Growing up fast was a survival tactic. If you could not look after yourself on the streets by the time you were into double digits, you were as good as dead. Oh, somebody might take pity on you and take you under their wing, but chances are they would be doing so entirely for their own gain. You either fended for yourself or you were someone's slave. Even parents could only do so much. Sooner or later, everyone had to stand by themselves. Rodin had seen gangs of youths barely reaching up to his chest take on grown men. He had seen them work in packs, cutting off escape routes. He had seen them using whatever tools they could find. They would pick on lone individuals, no matter how tough that person. They could only look in so many directions at once. Enough children, and one of them could get close enough to strike. And a well-placed iron bar on the ankles or kneecap was enough to fell even the toughest. It took a certain type of detachment to fight back against kids too. Rodin knew this from experience, forcing himself to see them as predators intent on doing harm rather than children. He knew others wouldn't have that detachment. Who would want to be seen striking someone so young? And the gangs of kids used this. They relied on strength in numbers. They took what they could. And it prepared them for their adult lives. Take what you can. Do what you need to do. Rodin felt he should have memories of these kinds of activities. With his job, and the way he operated, it made sense that he had always been one to make his own way. But there was nothing. Nothing before he reached that hideaway. Over 2 decades of living and still a child. He passed a street and a shrub caught his eye. He wanted to call it a tree, and maybe at one time that was what it had been. But now it was a dying shrub, its leaves yellowed, stalks showing through the tattered foliage. Yet he saw it how it had been. He remembered how his sleeve had become soaked as he brushed past. The house would be further down, about 6 properties in. He could almost make out the garden. Beneath the overgrown tangle, he could picture the path, the cleared flower beds. And he remembered that last day. They must have become slack. When she let him in, she must have left the door unlocked. Maybe she thought he'd locked it. And then, there was another man in the bedroom. He'd been tall, angry-looking. There had been shouting, accusations. She had been sitting up, screaming at him. There was a history here. There had been a slap. He knew it was a slap, but at the time his memories told him the man struck the woman hard. She flew to one side. The image, the memory, took over. A large man striking a naked, defenseless woman. In her own house. In her own bedroom. And the man was reaching round with his fist raised. Ready to beat someone who was already down. The injustice made him seethe. He knew this was wrong on so many levels. The violence, the invasion of privacy, the domineering attitude. There was no attempt at understanding, no attempt at resolution. And he had responded. He had done what had to be done. He pushed the man. That was all. A little push. He'd been struck himself. There had been laughter as he fell from the bed, landing in a heap on the floor. His jaw throbbed. There was a coppery taste in his mouth. There were sounds from the other side of the bed. Shouts, yells and slaps and thuds of blows striking home. He couldn't remember where the blade had been. He had no recollection of her bringing it up to the bedroom, but he saw it in his hand. It felt heavy. His fingers curved round the handle, finding grooves. It felt secure. It felt like it was meant to be. The memories became jumbled, a series of images and sensations with no order. A look of shock on a bearded face. Screams that might have been his own. Sudden pain in his right shoulder. And lots of blood. 2 bodies on the floor. She had a face that he no longer recognized. Her nose was spread out, the side of her scalp was missing chunks of hair, her lips were torn and bloody. Her eyes were turned to him, but they saw nothing. The man lay unmoving on top of her. Blood covered his clothes, flowing from the multitude of stab wounds. Rodin had been lucky. That was the only explanation for his survival. He had attacked the man in a frenzy. He doubted he would have won otherwise. Was that his first kill? It felt like it, but there was so much still unknown. He remembered the feelings, as he'd stood over the 2 bodies. There was pride in winning, but also fear. Fear that he might have to do the same thing again. And then excitement. He might have to do the same thing again. He'd never felt so alive. At least he thought he hadn't. Even now, over a decade later, there was still a thrill from direct action, from being in that moment. Mind and body working together, the well-placed strike bringing an opponent down, an expert move bringing a contract to fulfillment. He wouldn't describe it as excitement, not now. But it was when he felt alive. The woman in the bed, saying that their times together were the only times she felt alive. Living, not simply existing. He didn't want to see the house again. It would be different, and would mean nothing to him. He carried on walking. The surroundings brought forth more memories. He couldn't remember how long he'd spent in the hideout. There was another building close by, after the woman. He'd lived in a house not hers but one similar, maybe slightly smaller. He'd protected himself with weapons. He had images of cleaning them on a small wooden table, a dim light swaying overhead, although why it moved he could not say. He'd stayed a few months, maybe a year, and he'd grown. He had arrived as a child and left as a man. And he knew why the tunnel had such a pull. He was from the north. Not the north of this dome but from beyond. He had followed the tunnel through the wilds. Ridiculous, but he knew it was true. Rodin thought back to all he knew of the domes and the network of tunnels. The closest was called a dome, a few hundred miles away. He calculated, thinking he would have been walking for about a week and a half. No doubt he was in better shape now, but the Rodin who had made that journey had youth on his side. He let his feet find their own route across the cracked tarmac of the streets. They knew their way. He trusted them. They knew how to find that safe spot. The one area with rules. The area Ratch and Sharoff must have made for. He knew this was an assumption, but it was all he had. If they were heading elsewhere, Rodin was lost. If they wandered to another part of the edge, they were as good as dead anyway. Two controllers who cared too much for their workers. Two controllers who were not built for confrontation. Yet when Rodin found them, that was what they would have. A confrontation. Did Ratch deserve this? Did the man deserve to die on the whim of a grief-stricken old man? Part of Rodin argued, as it always did, that death was simply another part of life. It happened to everyone, sooner or later. At least Rodin could ensure it was relatively pain-free and quick. But the man was young. Just as Rodin had been. Ratch had his workers and would do anything for them. Rodin had the woman, the intimacy they had shared. He had trusted her to lock the door. Maybe she had trusted him to do likewise. A mistake had been made. But he'd survived and he'd learnt. It was what growing up was all about. Learn from mistakes. Use the bad times to develop strength, develop resilience. Didn't Ratch deserve this too? Didn't he deserve another chance? Besides, he was not in this situation because of a mistake he'd made. He had hired a worker who had an unknown medical condition, and who had died while in his employ. Effie was dead. Her father wanted Ratch to follow her. Who was in the wrong? Who deserved to die? Why did it always come back to death? Maybe he had the whole thing about face. Instead of asking who deserved to die, maybe he should be asking who deserved a second chance. No. Those were not his decisions to make. He had a job to do. He did the job, he collected his reward. Even if he had no need for the money, the job was what he did. Again memories of dream, Paskia's voice spoke to him, this is not who you are. But at the moment it was. He was who he was. He needed to follow his path to the end. Ratch was further north. Rodin was closing in.